Suicide, and Loins Mac Newson, Tristan and Romeo and Juliet.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So today I'm going to be presenting on agency and suicide, and I'm sure as most of us are pretty aware by now, well-behaved women rarely make history, but as my research will show, dead sluts tend to be extremely popular. Specifically, these three women. We have Loins Mac Newson, which is a pre-Christian Irish tale starring Deirdre, which has been transformed into the play Deirdre of the Sorrows, which is still performed to this day. We have Tristan and Isolde, which is a around 1200s medieval Europe tale that has now become a Wagner opera, as well as a 2006 Franco movie, which is awful. And then we have Romeo and Juliet, which is from the early modern period and continues to be extremely popular throughout English-speaking culture, and I'm sure other cultures as well. So each of these stories have this insane staying power, but it's not just the stories themselves, but the structure of it. And the structure is called a theta by Alwyn and Brendan Rees, which translates to elopement. So you have a young woman eloping with a young man away from her socially mandated lover. And these three specifically also have that elopement ending in suicide, specifically the women's suicide. And it's this that I'm going to focus on, and how the aspect of suicide has to be made into an act of agency by the women so that they can be punished for their improper behavior without the audience experiencing any sort of complicated feelings about that. And I don't expect you to really know these stories because some of them are a little bit obscure, so I'll give you a quick rundown. Loins Mac Newson, or the exile of the sons of Ishlu, stars Deirdre. She is prophesied to be so beautiful she's going to cause death and destruction. So as a baby, even though the people of Ulster want her to be killed, King Conchobar decides that this beautiful, sexy baby needs to be raised as his lover. She elopes with Moishu, and his brothers come with them. They leave before eventually coming back because Conchobar promises safety. He is lying, and he has Moishu killed by a man named Aegon, and then recaptures Deirdre to go back to her status as his sexual plaything. He then threatens to rape her, and she kills herself by bashing her head against a rock. In Tristan and Isolde, we have the young Irish princess Isolde, who is promised to be married to King Mark of Cornwall. Mark's nephew, Tristan, comes to get her from Ireland. She hates Tristan because he killed her uncle. It's complicated, it's awful. They accidentally drink a love potion and fall wildly and deeply in love. And this love potion makes things a little complicated. We're going to talk about it more. But this is a courtly romance, so the love potion allows them to kind of explore these themes of sex without the weight that it would otherwise have in a courtly love. This love potion also ties their lives together, so one cannot die and have the other one live. They have lots of sex, and they do lots of tricks in order to have that sex, but eventually Tristan has to leave court, and he goes off and remarries somebody else named Isolde, because that's how things are, apparently. And then he gets injured, and he needs the first Isolde to come heal him. She's coming, but the second Isolde is mad at Tristan, and so she tells him that the first Isolde isn't coming, and so he kills himself, kind of, to wound that first Isolde. She gets there, she finds that he's dead, and then she kills herself as well by rendering up her spirit. It's not violent. And then we get to Romeo and Juliet. We have Romeo and Juliet from warring families. Juliet is about to be engaged to a man named Paris that she is not into. She sees Romeo, they fall in love, and they get married. Romeo kills her cousin, he gets banished. Juliet is upset about that. She's still betrothed to Paris, so she fakes her death. Romeo doesn't get the memo that it is a fake death, and so he comes back, kills himself over her body, and then she wakes up and kills herself by stabbing. So for each of these women, with some sort of caveats, suicide is offering a choice in the face of a world that does not want to offer that, a world that wants to shame them and coerce them into things that they do not desire. And they do view this as power. Juliet very specifically says, if all else failed, myself have the power to die. And so if we look a little closer at their prior attitudes towards death, and then compare that with the coercive presences that do lead them eventually into suicide, we can kind of get a better view of the agency involved in their actual deaths. For Deirdre, she's living under this prophecy, but one of the few things in her life that isn't influenced by that is her death. Her death is not at all part of this prophecy. And she's also not suicidal throughout her story. she actually lives for an entire year before killing herself, even as she's captured, and everyone she loves is gone or dead. But it isn't until she is being very, very, very clearly threatened with rape, not only by Conchobar, but by the man who killed her lover, Noishu, that she kills herself. She uses it as an escape from this really vile threat of violence. And then we get to Isolde, who is way more complicated than that because of the love potion. Before she takes this love potion, she is, she does threaten suicide at least once, but as a solution to being betrothed to someone she does not want to marry. Once she has taken the love potion, she knows that her life is tied to Tristan, and that alters the way that she acts. She does, however, still view it as a way to escape pain. When Tristan leaves, she is distraught, obviously, and she does think about suicide. She considers it, but she says, basically, that if she kills herself, that'll hurt Tristan. She has to let that go. She just has to be miserable. Tristan is getting remarried. And then when she does get to her death, it's really not clear whether or not it's a true suicide because Tristan's death is so closely tied to hers. But within the story and the way she speaks about it, she does view it as a choice and as her duty as his lover. And then Juliet, she is similar to Isolde in threatening suicide when people are telling her to do things she doesn't want to do, or she's meeting with circumstances she doesn't want to interact with. But she's also very, very careful to avoid death at all costs. She is terrified of death, and she has several really powerful monologues about how scared she is about that, and she does work pretty hard to avoid having to kill herself, but she does use it as a final option to not compromise herself. And if we look at where she is when she is being forced into this suicide, she has just woken up with her lover, her escape from Verona, dead over her body, and she's offered an escape by the friar and to take her to a nunnery. But for her, throughout this place, she's had this sexual awakening, and to go back to a nunnery to be walled in, she has to let go of all this development she's had throughout the play, and that's not an option. Her other option would be to be discovered by her father, who just a scene prior threatened to disown her when she tried to delay her own marriage. And in a lot of productions, she's actually assaulted by him during that scene. So it's not that surprising that she would choose to kill herself rather than to die at his hand. So when we look at these together, we can see how each of these women view suicide as an escape, as something within their control so that they can control how they die and how they live. But they also aren't the only characters in these stories. And for the other characters, suicide also plays a role. In Exile of the Sons of Ishlu, Deirdre is this sort of source of strength, and the scholar Ella Johnston writes that her death is able to close this circle of violence that has kind of filled the kingdom of Ulster, and allows Conchobar to remain a king for an epic that takes place after this story. Isolde, the story just ends with her, so there isn't much to look at, so I'm just going to let her be. But for Romeo and Juliet, their deaths bring together these warring families, also ending a cycle of violence. And within the stories as well, we can look at how religious characters view this. And these were all written in early Christian times. Even Exile of the Sons of Ishlu, which was technically pre-Christian, was written down by a clergyman. But within these stories, there's no religious criticism of the suicide. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet is actually praised by a religious figure for her bravery in pursuing suicide rather than bigamy. And Isolde's death is seen as an act of love rather than a suicide. So given this analysis, it's really tempting to call these stories of feminine agency and how women are able to escape cruel bonds of patriarchy. But that's wrong, because we can't just look at how things are in the stories. We have to look at the role it plays for the audience and the author. These are really complicated women. They are doing some really horrible things. Deirdre knows that her actions are going to kill people. Isolde at one point tries to have her best and only friend killed to hide her affair. And Juliet is constantly disobeying her parents. She's sneaking around, she's having sex without any sort of permission. But they're allowed to do that, and they're allowed to be compelling and lovable characters. And they're allowed to do this because their deaths remove any sort of complicated feelings an audience would have towards them. And not only are they removing these feelings by just making them dead and gone, they're absolving them of that complication. Remember how there's no religious criticism of these stories, because their acts of suicide are really acts of penance for their other sins that they're committing. But it's not only that they are being remove these complications, they also have to be punished. And there's a direct correlation between how boundary pushing and consciously boundary pushing these women are and how violent their deaths are. We have Deirdre, who knows her actions are going to kill people and does it anyway, and she has to bash her head against a rock until she dies. Juliet is constantly disobeying her parents, and she has to stab herself. And then Isolde, who is protected by this love potion, can just let go of her life and have a really peaceful death. And it's also extremely important that these punishments, and they are punishments, are being enacted by the women themselves, so that they can be punished without becoming martyrs. Without a killer to blame, it's easier to love the dead without any sort of fear that they become centers of righteous anger. Instead, once they've done their penance, once they've been punished, they're able to be purified and made simple. And what else can we really expect an author to do? Because if we let them live and they're happy, they become inspirations. If we let them live and they're being captured and tortured, then we have this ongoing nastiness to deal with. And if you have them killed by a different character, we see them as victims, and there's the worry that there will be anger towards the killers and thus the social fabric that created those killers. But if they carry out their own execution, they become tragic and grievable objects, devoid of any sort of controversy. That is why these suicides need to be acts of agency, like choices that the women are making, so that they are responsible for their fates, so they can become pitiable corpses with nobody to blame but themselves. And it's truly, it's really easy and compelling to kind of ignore this and let it be a product of the time in which these were written. But these are really popular stories to this day, and they are reproduced over and over again, and so are these same conditions I'm talking about. And for this, I'm going to point to the Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet, which I would argue is probably the most well-known version. And in that, we have Juliet, played by Claire Danes, dressed in white. She is dressed as an angel, and she is made simple. Her monologues on death and fear are cut from the story, and she just becomes this sexy and innocent creature. So over and over, we tell this story, from elopement to suicide, so that we can enjoy the excitement of drama and sex and the catharsis of tragedy without any of the anger and guilt it should be producing. Because we can leave those complicated emotions on the bodies of these women, dying with them, so that then we can go out and recreate the world that made their survival unthinkable. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, questions?
Sort of wonder, do you see these sort of trends of sort of female suicide and sort of female suffering within sort of modern literature? I feel like there's a lot of depictions of that as sort of payback almost.
Yeah, I wouldn't really know. I don't think I've read a lot of modern books that are dealing with these similar things, but that could be completely a product of my own taste rather than any sort of trends. But I think if you're noticing it and you're noticing similar things, that's definitely possible because you like this sort of thing, it seems.
Question. I kind of loathe Romeo and Juliet.
That's been, my advisor did too.
I'm
So.
really appalled that it's still taught in high schools. I think it's ridiculous.
What is it
I
about
wonder what
it?
you think about like perpetuating that story and that narrative in
I
modern
think
times.
it depends on the lens you're teaching it in. So when I watch Romeo and Juliet, and when I watch a version that is well done, I really like the RSC 2018 version. When it treats this, it can kind of show, I think, more how the systems are forcing these children into really awful situations. Because if you view it as just a love story of impulsive teenagers who are killing themselves for love, then it's like, maybe we shouldn't be teaching high schoolers this. But when you're viewing it more as, look at Juliet, who is being forced to marry someone she doesn't want to, and she sees an escape, and she goes for that escape, and when that escape is taken away, she takes it into her own hands, then I think that makes it a little more complicated. Whether or not you can do that in a high school classroom depends on how much time you have and what sort of resources you have, but I think there is a lot of value to it, and a lot of value in looking deeper than the love story, because it's a tragedy. It is not a romance, it is a tragedy, and we need to treat it as such.
In the black writing.
Question. So basically, what is your opinion of this? So essentially, it seems like the authors are using these characters to convey that they're severely disempowered, and the only way to empower in that culture, in that time, that the only way to really empower themselves is through suicide. So, A, do you think that the authors, right now, if we would project onto it, not the authors, but now and projecting onto it, if we were to teach that, we might say, okay, you know, if these characters had more constructive ways of living, if they could just go to a symposium, or if they could just go be educated, or if they had some kind of empowerment, might they make different choices? And B, do you feel like that they are committing suicide is a way for them to then absolve, like you're saying, it's absolving their consciences, but it's also a way for us as the reader to look at, say, this is a result of lack of constructive empowerment.
Okay, that was a really long question, so I'm gonna try to answer it, but I'm not sure if I'm totally getting what you're asking me. I think, because these are kind of mixed, that the authors of these stories, they want us to look at them as choices the women are making towards it, but we can also look at it how they're being kind of shepherded and forced into suicide being the only way to maintain any sort of, not life, but protection over their own bodies and selves. And in teaching this, I think we have to just look at those angles and look at the time period in which these were written. And I don't feel like I'm answering your question, but if you want to repeat like a part of it, maybe I can.
Just saying that might we look at it, and of course it's brutal, it's a tragedy, and we could argue that these women were disempowered because of the social construct and the cultural norm that they came from. Could we argue, in looking at it now, like you're saying, the lens that we look at it, could we argue that the lack of constructive outlet leads to finding empowerment in things that are destructive?
I think partially yes. I don't know that I would necessarily consider it empowerment, but more so a sort of protection of the self. So yeah, kind of, I think.
We have one, possibly two more questions, and we'll finish.
Mine kind of plays off of hers a little bit in the sense that what I'm getting from this, and also as I read older literature, is that you have to kind of take scraps from literature that you read, especially literature this old, because there is no good representation. There is no accurate or good outcome for these protagonists. So as we're reading these, we have to take the scraps of feminism that we can, because there is none. And so that's what I was getting from your presentation, is like, suicide is not a constructive end, and it's not used as empowerment, but we might take it as such because that's the only thing we can get from those stories that is even remotely akin to good representation.
Yeah, I think if we want to put our 21st century selves looking at it as trying to capture the character and connect with feelings of their things, absolutely. I think in an academic sense, if you're just trying to analyze these types of things, you do kind of have to remember that this was not written for you, and it was not written for our time period, and it was not written in the society that we really recognize. And even like if I'm dealing with exiles in Ishlu, a society that we have a ton of record on. There is a lot from medieval Ireland, but there's also a lot that we don't have, especially with the lives of women. So it's difficult to even bring it into our time period. So it depends on the lens you're looking at it through and like what you want from it. So Romeo and Juliet, I want to connect with Juliet. I want to, love her character and feel for her character. And so I might put that modern lens on it. For something else, I might not do that.
We have actually 1 minute and 40 seconds for one. Do you want to ask? Or do you want? Okay, all right. But maybe you could approach afterwards. Okay. Can we give one more round of applause?